The Grand Hall of the Intergalactic Academy was filled with the chatter of hundreds of alien students. The room itself was massive, with walls made of smooth black stone that reflected the dim purple lights hanging from the ceiling. Glowing alien symbols floated mid-air, casting soft patterns across the polished floor. Holographic banners displaying the insignias of different galactic species flickered along the walls. Every seat was occupied by students from every corner of the known galaxy. Species with claws, fur, scales, and even those with exoskeletons. Some students floated in midair, others sat cross-legged, their bioluminescent skin pulsing faintly. Despite the variety of species, one thing was clear: this was a gathering of the galaxy's elite. Only the strongest, smartest, and most gifted were allowed to study here. In the middle row, sitting alone, was Ethan, the only human in the academy. He was small compared to the towering reptilian forms of the Crocs or the sleek, feline-like Virions. His dark hair fell messily over his forehead, and his pale hands gripped the sides of his seat tightly. He kept his head down, trying to ignore the whispers and glances being thrown his way. The humans' acceptance into the academy had been controversial. The other species viewed humanity as primitive, physically weak and technologically behind. The only reason humans had been allowed to join was due to a rare diplomatic agreement with the Galactic Council. The noise of the room faded as the towering figure of Professor Klax floated to the center of the hall. Klax was a tall, thin being with shimmering blue skin and 6 elongated arms that drifted lazily at his sides. His head was featureless except for 2 small, glowing slits where eyes might have been. His body seemed to ripple with energy as he spoke, his voice echoing directly into the minds of every student. Attention, students. The room fell completely silent. The Galactic Council has issued a new challenge, one that will determine the true strength of your species. His glowing eyes pulsed softly. You will write an essay titled, "What Makes Your Species Strong?" The Council believes that understanding strength, true strength, is essential to maintaining peace in the galaxy. A low murmur ran through the room as students processed the announcement. Professor Klax raised a hand, and the hall fell silent once more. You have 24 hours to complete your essay. This will not be graded based on writing skill or style. The Council seeks understanding. His gaze swept across the hall, pausing briefly on Ethan. Good luck. The moment the professor disappeared, the noise returned, louder than before. Ethan could feel the stares of the other students boring into his back. He tried to keep his face calm, but his heart was hammering in his chest. A Croc student sitting 2 rows back leaned forward, his yellow eyes flashing. What's a human going to write about strength? He sneered. His voice was deep and guttural. Strength comes from superior genetics and raw power. Your species has neither. A nearby Virion laughed softly. Maybe he'll write about running away. Humans are good at that. Ethan's hands curled into fists on his knees. He could feel his face burning, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. A soft voice beside him made him turn. A slender alien girl with smooth silver skin and large violet eyes was watching him. She was a Litharian, known for their advanced telepathic abilities. Her name was Sarai. She tilted her head curiously. What are you going to write about? Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know yet. Sarai studied him for a moment before smiling faintly. I think you do. Ethan didn't respond. He stood and made his way toward the exit, ignoring the whispers and smirks from the other students. As he passed by a tall, armored student from the Tarlac species, a sharp elbow jabbed into his side. He stumbled, but caught himself before falling. The Tarlac student grinned down at him. Careful, human, the Tarlac hissed. You're fragile. Ethan straightened, holding the other student's gaze for a moment before walking away without a word. His heart was racing. His hands trembled as he left the hall and stepped into the quiet corridor beyond. He made his way through the sleek, metallic halls of the academy, his footsteps echoing softly. When he reached his small dormitory, he slid the door shut behind him and leaned against it, breathing hard. His room was small and simple, a narrow bed, a small desk, and a single window overlooking the vast blackness of space. The stars seemed so close, like he could reach out and touch them. Ethan sat down at his desk and activated the holographic terminal. A blank document floated in the air in front of him. The words, "What makes your species strong?" flashed across the top of the page. His fingers hovered over the console, but he didn't type anything. His mind was swirling. The Crocs and Virions weren't wrong. Humans didn't have superior strength, technology, or speed. What was humanity's strength? He closed his eyes, and a memory rose to the surface, sharp and painful. His colony burning. Eye-controlled warships blotting out the sky, the sound of alarms and screaming. His mother shoving him into an escape pod, her face streaked with sweat and blood. "Go," she had screamed. "Survive." He remembered the look in her eyes. Not fear, not anger, but love. She had known she wouldn't survive. And still, she had stayed behind so that he could live. Ethan opened his eyes. His throat was tight. His hands curled into fists. Slowly, he began to type. Strength is not in muscle or technology. Strength is in sacrifice. Strength is knowing that you might not survive, but you protect the ones you love anyway. Strength is choosing to fight, even when you know you might lose. His vision blurred as he continued typing. He poured everything into the words. The pain of losing his mother, the fear of growing up alone, the quiet strength that had come from surviving. His heart raced as the words flowed. He didn't stop until his fingers ached and the document was filled with text. When he finally leaned back, his hands were shaking. He stared at the words floating before him. His heart was hammering in his chest, not from fear, but from certainty. They thought humans were weak because they didn't have superior weapons or advanced technology. But strength wasn't about power. It was about the willingness to sacrifice everything, even your life, for someone else. Ethan smiled faintly. He knew exactly what his strength was. And tomorrow, the rest of the galaxy would know too. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the holographic screen floating in front of him. His essay was still open, the words glowing faintly in the dim light of his small room. His fingers hovered over the console, but he couldn't bring himself to type anymore. His heart was still racing from the flood of emotions that had poured out of him earlier. He had written the truth, raw and painful, but now that the rush had faded, doubt was creeping in like a cold fog. What if it wasn't enough? The other students had every advantage. The Crocs were physically stronger, their muscular bodies enhanced by generations of genetic engineering. The Virions were fast and agile, with reflexes so sharp they could dodge plasma fire. The Karlak had advanced exosuits that made them nearly invincible in battle. Even the Litharians, like Sarai, possessed powerful telepathic and psychic abilities. Humanity had none of that. Humans were fragile, weak. Ethan rubbed his face with his hands, his mind swirling with uncertainty. Maybe the others were right. What could humans possibly have to offer a galaxy filled with species so far beyond them? He wasn't even sure why the Galactic Council had allowed a human into the Academy in the first place. Maybe they had just felt sorry for them. After all, humanity had barely survived the AI war. The machines had nearly wiped them out. If not for a last-minute counterattack by a coalition of desperate human colonies, they would have been extinct by now. He took a shaky breath and stood up, crossing the room to the small window. Outside, the stars stretched endlessly in every direction. In the distance, a massive ring-shaped station floated among the stars, the Galactic Academy itself. Its metallic frame gleamed under the faint light of a nearby star. Beyond it, smaller ships drifted through the blackness, their engines pulsing faintly. Ethan pressed his hand against the cold glass. He could almost feel the weight of the galaxy pressing down on him. He had been taught since childhood that humans were survivors, adaptable, stubborn, capable of enduring anything. But was that enough? Survival wasn't strength. It was just not dying. That wasn't the same thing. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. His door slid open, and Sarai stepped inside. Her silver skin shimmered faintly under the soft light, and her large violet eyes seemed to glow. She was holding 2 small cups in her hands. "I thought you might need something to calm your mind," she said softly, holding one of the cups out to him. Ethan hesitated, then took it. A faint, fruity scent rose from the cup. He sat down on the edge of his bed, and Sarai sat cross-legged on the floor beside him. "You look troubled," she said after a moment. Ethan stared at the dark liquid in his cup. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing." Sarai tilted her head. "You mean the essay?" Ethan nodded. "What if I'm wrong? What if strength is about power and speed and technology? What if humans just don't have enough of it?" Sarai's gaze softened. "I don't think you believe that." "I don't know what I believe," Ethan said, his voice tightening. "Maybe I'm just trying to convince myself that humans matter, that we have something the rest of the galaxy doesn't." He shook his head. "But what if I'm wrong?" Sarai leaned forward, setting her cup on the floor. Her eyes darkened slightly. "Do you know why I'm at this academy?" Ethan frowned. "Because you're smart." Sarai smiled faintly. "That's what they say. But it's not the real reason." Her gaze grew distant. "My planet was invaded when I was young. The invaders were stronger, faster. They tore through our cities in days. My family was killed in the first wave." Her voice tightened slightly. "I survived because an old soldier, a human, found me. He was wounded, barely able to walk. But he carried me through the war zone and got me to safety." Ethan's eyes widened. "A human?" Sarai nodded. "He didn't have weapons or armor, just his bare hands and his determination. He fought off soldiers twice his size and faced down war machines with nothing but a broken rifle and his own body. He saved me, not because he was stronger, but because he refused to give up." Her violet eyes softened. "Strength isn't about power, Ethan. It's about resilience, about not breaking even when the universe is trying to crush you." Ethan's chest tightened. He thought of his mother, her desperate voice as she shoved him into the escape pod. Go, survive. He thought of the countless human soldiers who had fought and died during the AI war, holding the line even when they knew they wouldn't survive. Humanity had always been outmatched, but they kept going. They never stopped fighting. "Maybe you're right," Ethan said quietly. Sarai smiled and stood up. "Of course I'm right." She walked toward the door, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Finish your essay, Ethan. The galaxy deserves to know what makes humans strong." After she left, Ethan sat for a long time, staring at the holographic screen. His heart was beating steadily now, calmer, clearer. He tapped the console, and the words of his essay appeared once more. He read through them slowly, his eyes lingering on the last line. "Strength is choosing to fight, even when you know you might lose." His fingers hovered over the console. A part of him still doubted. Maybe the others would laugh at him. Maybe the council would reject his essay. Maybe the Crocs and Virians were right. Maybe humanity was weak. But that didn't matter. He had written the truth, and strength wasn't about knowing you would win. It was about standing up even when you knew you might lose. Ethan took a deep breath and added a final line to his essay. "Strength is the willingness to sacrifice for those you love." He sent the document with a sharp click. A small confirmation appeared on the screen. Submission accepted. Ethan leaned back and closed his eyes. His heart was steady now. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But whatever came next, he was ready for it. The classroom was buzzing with quiet tension as Ethan walked in. Rows of students from across the galaxy sat in the tiered seating, their eyes glowing faintly under the soft lighting. The walls of the classroom pulsed with holographic projections, star charts, battle simulations, historical records of galactic conflicts. At the front of the room, Instructor Drax stood with his arms crossed, his massive Crocs frame towering over the rest of the class. His crimson scales glinted under the white lights, and his yellow eyes narrowed as Ethan entered. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He had been dreading this moment. His essay had been submitted, reviewed, and now it was going to be evaluated publicly in front of the entire class. This wasn't just a routine evaluation. It was the first time a human's perspective on strength was being analyzed by the Galactic Council's top military academy. And now, Ethan was going to have to defend it. He sat down near the back, sliding into the smooth, curved seat. Sarai was sitting a few rows ahead of him. She turned her head slightly and gave him a small smile. Ethan felt a flicker of reassurance, but it wasn't enough to stop the wave of anxiety that curled through his stomach. "Attention," Instructor Drax growled, his deep voice vibrating through the room. The holographic screens behind him blinked off, leaving the room in silence. "Today, we review the final strategic essays from the class." His gaze swept across the room. "Several of you submitted predictable strategies, tactical models we've seen hundreds of times. But one essay stood out." Ethan's stomach dropped. He already knew what was coming. Instructor Drax tapped a clawed finger against a console. A line of text appeared on the massive screen behind him, glowing faintly in the dim light. "Strength is the willingness to sacrifice for those you love." A murmur swept through the class. Ethan felt his face flush as dozens of alien eyes turned toward him. Croc students with their armored scales, Varians with their sleek, insectoid frames, and Sarlacc with their glowing cybernetic implants. They were all watching him now. Instructor Drax's gaze sharpened. Ethan called her, "Stand." Ethan's legs felt heavy as he stood up. His heart was thundering in his chest. He tried to steady his breathing, but the weight of so many eyes on him made it impossible to stay calm. "This," Instructor Drax's claw hovered beneath the text, "is what you define as strength." Ethan swallowed. His throat was dry. "Yes, sir." The Croc's general's lip curled. "Not firepower. Not advanced technology. Not genetic superiority. No, sir." A Croc student near the front snorted. "Ridiculous. Humans always try to romanticize weakness." A Varian student's metallic voice buzzed from the side. "Sacrifice is the strategy of the weak. It's what you do when you don't have enough power to win." Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides. His pulse was hammering in his ears. He glanced toward Sarai. She was watching him closely, her violet eyes calm. Instructor Drax's gaze sharpened. "Explain yourself," Cadet called her. Ethan forced himself to breathe. He looked up at the screen, at his own words glowing brightly above him. "Strength isn't about firepower or technology," he said. His voice was steady, despite the tremor running through his chest. "It's about will. The strength to keep fighting even when you know you might lose. The strength to stand up even when the enemy is stronger, faster, and better equipped." The Croc student scoffed. "That's not strength. That's stupidity." Ethan's gaze darkened. "Is it?" He turned toward the student. "Would you die to protect someone else? Would you throw yourself into the fire to save a comrade?" The Croc's face twisted. "That's irrelevant." "No, it's not," Ethan said. His voice was rising now, cutting through the tension in the room. "Machines are powerful. I-fleets are nearly indestructible. They calculate every battle with precision. They know exactly how to maximize their advantage." His jaw tightened, but they don't care. They don't fight to protect each other. They fight because they're programmed to. Humans fight because we care about the people standing next to us. A silence fell over the room. Ethan's chest was heaving now, but he wasn't finished. "My mother died during the AI War," Ethan said. His voice was raw now, but he forced himself to keep going. "She put me into an escape pod, knowing she wouldn't make it out alive. She stayed behind to fight so I could live." His fists tightened. She knew she would die, But she fought anyway, because strength isn't about surviving. It's about what you're willing to give up so someone else can survive. The Croc student's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. Instructor Drax's yellow eyes narrowed. His clawed hand tapped the console, and a projection of a battle scene appeared behind him. A simulation from the AI war. Human ships, smaller and weaker, were being torn apart by a massive AI fleet. But in the center of the screen, a squadron of human fighters broke formation and hurled themselves directly into the AI flagship. They died to buy time for the evacuation, Drax said quietly. The AI flagship was destroyed in the process. The humans won the battle. Ethan nodded, because they were willing to sacrifice themselves, not because they were stronger, because they cared more. A cold silence stretched through the room. Even the Crocs and Virian students were quiet now. Ethan could feel the tension shifting, the weight of doubt settling over the aliens. Instructor Drax's gaze was hard. You believe that strength comes from sacrifice? Yes, Ethan said. His voice was steady now. Strength comes from knowing you might lose, but fighting anyway. Instructor Drax stared at him for a long moment. Then his lip curled in a faint smile. Interesting. The screen behind him blinked out. The lights brightened. That concludes today's session, Drax said. Dismissed. Ethan exhaled shakily as the other students began to gather their things. Sarai stood and made her way toward him. Her violet eyes shimmered faintly. That was, she smiled. Brave. Ethan shook his head. I just told the truth. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do. He started toward the door, but stopped when Instructor Drax's deep voice called after him. Cadet Calder. Ethan turned. The Croc's general's yellow eyes were sharp and calculating. Your essay, Drax said slowly, has been submitted to the council for review. Ethan's breath caught. Why? Because, Drax said, if you're right, it changes everything. Ethan's heart hammered as he walked out of the classroom. Sarai fell into step beside him. What happens now? She asked. Ethan smiled faintly. We'll see. Ethan had barely sat down for his next class when the backlash started. It came fast and brutal. As soon as he entered the lecture hall, he could feel the weight of 100 eyes on him. The Croc students were glaring openly, their golden eyes narrowed with disdain. The Virians clicked their mandibles in quiet disapproval, their sleek forms turning away as he passed. Even the Tarlac, who rarely interacted with anyone outside their own species, had stopped their quiet conversations and were staring at him with cold mechanical precision. Ethan sat down in his usual spot at the back of the hall, but the seat next to him was no longer occupied. Sarai usually sat there, but today the seat was empty. He glanced toward the front of the room and spotted her. She was sitting 2 rows down, not alone, but surrounded by a group of Crocs and Virian students. She didn't look at him. His chest tightened painfully. He knew this was coming. He just hadn't expected it to feel this sharp. The holoscreen at the front of the room flared to life, displaying news headlines scrolling across the screen. Human Cadet challenges galactic military doctrine. Strength through sacrifice. Croc's military council demands investigation into human ideology. Are humans promoting self-destruction as a tactic? Ethan's throat tightened. His words from the essay were being torn apart across the entire galactic network. Political analysts were dissecting every line, questioning his motives, questioning whether humanity could be trusted as an ally. The council was furious, not just with Ethan, but with the entire human delegation. His name was circulating through military briefings, and his face had been plastered across news reports. The instructor walked in, cutting off the quiet tension in the room. Instructor Drax's golden eyes swept across the hall before settling briefly on Ethan. He said nothing. He simply activated the lesson, and a simulation of a battlefield appeared on the screen, a human fleet surrounded by eye-controlled warships. Cadet Calder. Drax's voice was sharp and cutting. Since you're so familiar with human strategies, Why don't you tell the class how you would handle this situation?" Ethan's face burned. He stood slowly, feeling every gaze lock onto him. His heart was pounding in his ears. He looked at the simulation. Human ships outnumbered and boxed in. It was a no-win scenario. The AI fleet had already calculated every possible human maneuver. "I would." Ethan's voice faltered. He glanced toward Sarai, but she still wasn't looking at him. "Well?" Drax's voice sharpened. "Would you sacrifice your fleet?" Ethan swallowed hard. "No." Drax's brow lifted. "Interesting. You seemed very certain in your last essay that sacrifice was the path to victory." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Sacrifice isn't the first option. It's the last one." A ripple of murmurs passed through the class. Ethan forced himself to breathe. "You don't throw lives away unless there's no other choice. Strength isn't in dying. It's in knowing when to stand and when to step back." Drax studied him for a long moment. "Show us." The simulation flickered, waiting for Ethan's input. His hands hovered over the console. He knew the answer the others were expecting. A standard human response. Throw ships at the problem until something breaks. But Ethan ignored that path. He focused on the pattern in the AI fleet's formation, the way the central ships moved a fraction slower than the perimeter guard. He adjusted the human fleet's formation, using a decoy maneuver to draw the AI guard toward the left flank. As soon as the AI ships adjusted, he redirected his main forces toward the exposed core. The simulation flared, and the AI flagship exploded. The screen froze on the burning wreckage. A quiet hush settled over the class. "Acceptable," Drax said, "but you lost 40% of your fleet." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Sometimes you can't win without losing something." Drax's gaze sharpened. "And if you had to order your crew to die?" Ethan's fists curled at his sides. "I'd give the order." His voice was steady now. "But I'd make damn sure they knew why they were fighting." Drax's eyes narrowed. "Sit down." Ethan sat back, his chest tight. A Croc student from the front row turned and sneered. "Your strategies are dangerous." "And yours are predictable," Ethan shot back. The Croc student's face darkened, but before he could respond, the class ended. Students began filing out, still casting sidelong glances at Ethan. Sarai was halfway to the door when Ethan caught up to her. "Hey." She stopped but didn't look at him. "You're avoiding me," Ethan said. She turned slowly, her violet eyes cold. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ethan frowned. "I submitted an essay." "You undermined the entire council's doctrine." Her voice was sharp. "They're talking about cutting human alliances. They think you're dangerous." "And what do you think?" Ethan asked. Sarai's gaze softened slightly, but she shook her head. "It doesn't matter what I think. It matters to me." Her gaze dropped to the floor. "Ethan, I think you might be right, but you're scaring them. The Crocs don't know how to handle sacrifice. They don't fight to protect each other. They fight to win." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And what happens when winning isn't enough?" She shook her head. "Just be careful." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away and walked out of the room. Ethan stood there for a long moment, his chest tight. His mind was racing, but his body felt cold and still. As he started toward the hallway, a tall figure stepped into his path. It was a Crocs, taller and heavier than any other in the class. His crimson scales were polished, and his golden eyes glinted with disdain. "You," the Crocs growled. "You're the human." Ethan's muscles tensed. "Yeah. You insult our military doctrine. You claim sacrifice is strength." The Crocs' mouth curled into a sharp smile. "Prove it." Before Ethan could react, the Crocs' fist shot forward, slamming into his ribs. Ethan hit the floor hard, gasping as the breath was knocked from his lungs. The Crocs crouched over him, his golden eyes glowing. "If you're so willing to sacrifice, let's see what you can take." Ethan rolled to the side, pain burning through his chest. He pushed himself to his feet, heart hammering. The crocs lunged again, but this time Ethan ducked and pivoted. He drove his elbow into the croc's side, feeling the impact vibrate through his arm. The crocs stumbled back, eyes flashing with surprise. Ethan's breath was ragged, but he steadied himself. He met the croc's gaze, his hands curling into fists. "Come on," Ethan said. "I'm not done." The croc's mouth curled into a sharp grin. He lunged again. But this time, Ethan was ready. Ethan stood outside the Galactic Council chamber, his hands curled into tight fists at his sides. The towering marble pillars and shimmering golden lights of the council hall felt suffocating. His heart was pounding, and the muscles in his back ached from tension. He could hear the murmurs from within the chamber, the low hum of alien voices, some sharp with anger, others laced with disbelief. He knew why they were angry. He had exposed their weakness. A human cadet, the lowest ranked species in the entire academy, had dared to challenge the military doctrine of the galactic superpowers. Ethan hadn't just submitted an essay. He had torn through the foundations of galactic strategy with nothing more than words. And the worst part, his words had made sense. The double doors to the chamber creaked open, and a tall Crocs guard in polished crimson armor stepped out. His golden eyes narrowed as they fixed on Ethan. "They're ready for you." Ethan straightened, forcing his shoulders back as he stepped through the doors. The council chamber was enormous, a circular room lined with massive stone pillars. The floor was made of polished black marble, and a ring of high-backed thrones surrounded the center platform. The representatives from the Crocs, Virions, Sarlacc, and nearly a dozen other species sat there, their eyes fixed on Ethan as he approached the platform. At the center of the chamber, Grand Chancellor Valter sat on the tallest throne. His scaled crimson face was impassive, his golden eyes cold and calculating. Valter was over 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a heavy cloak draped over his armored chest. He was a war hero, a figure of legend among the Crocs. His words shaped the policies of the Galactic Council. Ethan stepped onto the platform, feeling the weight of every gaze pressing down on him. He stood with his hands at his sides, meeting Valter's gaze head-on. "Cadet Ethan Calder." Valter's voice was deep and resonant. "You stand before this council to answer for the consequences of your actions." Ethan's jaw tightened. What consequences? A Virion representative clicked her mandibles, her iridescent green eyes narrowing. "The Crocs fleet has already begun mobilizing. They claim your essay promotes suicidal tactics that could destabilize the delicate balance of power within the galaxy." A Crocs representative leaned forward, his golden eyes burning with disdain. "Sacrifice is not strength. Strength is domination. Victory at any cost. You, human, speak of dying as though it is a virtue." Ethan's gaze sharpened. "Because sometimes it is." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Valter's gaze remained fixed on Ethan. "Explain." Ethan's chest tightened, but his voice was steady. "Strength isn't about surviving. It's about what you're willing to give up to protect the people you care about. Your doctrine is built on winning at any cost, even if that means sacrificing the lives of others to protect your own. Humans don't think that way. We don't fight to win. We fight to protect." The Crocs representative's mouth curled into a sneer, a convenient excuse for weakness. Ethan's fists curled. Is it weakness when a soldier throws himself on a grenade to save his squad? Is it weakness when a mother shields her child from an explosion? His voice rose. "Strength isn't about surviving. It's about knowing what's worth dying for." Silence gripped the chamber. Even the Crocs representative's sneer faltered. "Arrogant," the Virion hissed, "and naive." "It's why we survive," Ethan shot back. "You don't understand sacrifice because you've never had to make it. You fight for power. Humans fight for each other." Valter's gaze sharpened. "And yet, you've just admitted that sacrifice leads to loss." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Sometimes you lose, but if you protect the people you care about, if you give them a chance to keep going, that's still a victory. A low rumble passed through the council. Walter's gaze narrowed. "And you think your species' willingness to die will make you stronger?" "No," Ethan said. "Our willingness to protect each other will." The Croc's representative stood. His golden eyes blazed. "This is madness. If the humans wish to die for meaningless ideals, let them, but they will not drag the rest of the galaxy down with them." Walter raised a hand, silencing the room. His gaze was steady as he studied Ethan. "Your words have shaken the foundations of our military doctrine. The Croc's Council demands that your species either denounce these dangerous ideas or face sanctions." Ethan's heart pounded. He knew what this meant. If humanity was cut off from the Council, they'd lose access to trade routes, military alliances, and the protective treaties that kept human colonies safe. Without the Council's protection, humanity would be vulnerable, easy prey for the Outer Rim warlords. Ethan's voice steadied. "And if we refuse?" Walter's gaze darkened. "Then your species stands alone." Ethan's breath tightened. His mind raced through the implications. Earth cut off, colonies left defenseless, human trade ships attacked in open space. His words had put his entire species at risk. But even as the weight of that truth pressed down on him, Ethan stood straighter. "Then so be it." The Croc's representative laughed coldly. "Foolish." Ethan's gaze hardened. "You think humans are weak because we value life. You think we're soft because we care about each other." His eyes flashed. "You haven't seen what happens when you back a human into a corner." Walter's gaze remained steady. "We shall see." The chamber's doors opened behind Ethan, a silent command for him to leave. Ethan turned toward the exit, his heart hammering. He had just condemned humanity to stand alone. As he stepped into the hallway, Sarai was waiting for him. Her violet eyes were wide with disbelief. "Ethan." "I had to," Ethan said. "You just cut humanity off from the Council." Sarai's voice trembled. "We're alone now." "No," Ethan said softly. "We're never alone." Sarai's expression tightened. "What are you going to do?" Ethan's gaze sharpened. "We'll show them what humans can do." As he walked down the long marble corridor, the tension in his chest settled into something steady, something sharp and dangerous. They had underestimated humanity. Now, they were about to find out what that mistake would cost them. The cold vacuum of space stretched endlessly before Ethan as he stood on the observation deck of the Valkyrie, the flagship of the newly formed human defense fleet. Massive cruisers, battleships, and support craft floated in formation behind them, a force cobbled together from human colonies, independent traders, and the remnants of Earth's navy. It wasn't enough. Ethan's reflection stared back at him through the glass. Tired eyes, dark circles under them. His uniform clung to his frame, the once pristine fabric creased and worn from days of tension and preparation. He could feel the quiet hum of the ship beneath his feet, the pulse of the engines reverberating through the floor like a heartbeat. "They're coming." Sarai's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood beside him, her violet eyes sharp with tension. Her short silver hair framed her face, and her black combat suit glinted under the dim lights. "How many?" Ethan asked. Sarai's gaze hardened. "All of them." Ethan's chest tightened. The Galactic Council had declared humanity a rogue species, a destabilizing element. The Crocs, the Virians, and the Tarlac had united their fleets into a single armada. Hundreds of capital ships, thousands of fighters, a force large enough to erase humanity from existence. Ethan turned toward the center of the bridge, where Admiral Klein stood before a glowing holographic display of the battlefield. The blue icons representing the human fleet were dwarfed by the sea of red dots creeping toward them. "They'll be in firing range in 15 minutes, Klein said. His lined face was calm, but his jaw was tense. "We won't survive a head-on engagement. We're not going to survive, period," Sarai muttered. Ethan's gaze sharpened. "We don't need to win. We just need to hold them long enough to show them why they shouldn't have come." Klein's brow furrowed. "What are you thinking?" Ethan stepped toward the display, his mind racing. They're relying on their superior firepower and shields. Their formations are tight. They'll expect us to meet them in open combat. Klein's gaze darkened. We won't survive an open engagement. Exactly. Ethan's eyes narrowed. We lure them in. Make them think we're breaking. Then we hit them where it hurts. Sarai's eyes widened. You're talking about a trap. Ethan nodded. We hit their command ships, take out their leadership. Once they're disorganized, we strike. Klein's jaw tightened. And how exactly do you plan to hit their command ships when they'll be behind half a fleet of destroyers? Ethan's lips curled into a thin smile. We cloak. Sarai's breath caught. Cloaking technology hasn't been used in active combat. It's unstable, untested. Ethan's eyes darkened. So are we. Klein's expression hardened. You realize that if this fails, it won't. Ethan's voice cut through the tension. Because if it does, humanity dies. Klein stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. I'll have the fleet prepare for maneuvering. Ethan turned toward Sarai. Get the strike teams ready. We'll take the cloaked ships in close and disable their command vessels from the inside. Her violet eyes searched his face. This is insane. Ethan's jaw tightened. So is going down without a fight. A low rumble passed through the ship as the klaxon sounded. The red warning lights pulsed, bathing the bridge in crimson. Ethan's heart pounded as he stepped toward the viewport. In the distance, the first glints of light from the enemy fleet shimmered against the blackness of space. All ships, prepare for combat. Klein's voice was cold and sharp. Strike teams, to your launch bays. Ethan stood at the viewport, watching the enemy fleet grow larger. He could see the dark, jagged outlines of the Croc's dreadnoughts, the gleaming silver hulls of the Virian cruisers, the insect-like silhouettes of the Sarlacc carriers. Hope you're right about this, Sarai said quietly. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. They think humans are weak. They think we'll break. His hand tightened into a fist. Let's show them what happens when humans fight for each other. The fleet trembled as the first wave of enemy fire streaked toward them. Explosions flared in the darkness as the human cruisers took the brunt of the assault. Shields shimmered, flashing bright blue under the impact. Shields holding at 60%. A technician called out. Maintain formation. Klein barked. Ethan's gaze narrowed. Activate the cloaking field. On the display, several human ships flickered, and then disappeared. The enemy fleet's targeting scanners flickered in confusion. Strike teams, go. Ethan sprinted toward the launch bay, Sarai at his side. He could feel the hum of the ship's engines through his boots. The loading ramp of the strike ship hissed open. He strapped into his harness as the ship's pilot's voice crackled through the comms. 10 seconds to launch. Ethan's breathing steadied. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. 5 seconds. Sarai's gaze sharpened. Let's make them bleed. The strike ship shot forward, the inertial dampeners barely holding against the crushing force of acceleration. Ethan's stomach lurched as the ship twisted through the debris field. He could see flashes of light from the battle outside. Human ships holding the line against the enemy's relentless fire. Approaching command vessel, the pilot said. Cloaking field holding. The Sarlacc command vessel loomed ahead, a massive black spire bristling with weapons. Targeting bay doors, Ethan ordered. The ship's guns roared, shredding the command ship's shields. Explosions blossomed along its hull. Prepare for boarding, Ethan barked. The loading ramp hissed open, and Ethan leaped into the void. His magnetic boots locked onto the hull. Sarai followed, her rifle raised. They breached the command ship's airlock with a single charge. Inside, Sarlacc soldiers rushed toward them, long, insect-like limbs and plasma rifles flashing. Ethan raised his weapon and fired. The recoil slammed into his shoulder as the lead soldier crumpled. Sarai's rifle barked beside him, cutting down another. They pushed through the corridor toward the ship's command core. Ethan kicked open the reinforced door, his weapon raised. A Sarlacc admiral stood at the controls, his mandibles clicking in rage. "You think you can stop us?" the admiral hissed. Ethan's eyes flashed. "No." He raised his weapon. "We already have." He fired. The admiral's chest exploded in a spray of dark green blood. Alarms blared. The ship shuddered beneath their feet. "We need to move," Sarai yelled. They sprinted back to the airlock as the ship's engines detonated behind them. The strike ship pulled away just as the command vessel imploded in a burst of fire and debris. On the bridge of the Valkyrie, the red dots on the display began to flicker, then fade. The enemy fleet, leaderless and confused, began to retreat. Ethan stood on the observation deck, watching the enemy fleet withdraw. Sarai's hand found his arm. "You did it," she whispered. Ethan's gaze darkened. "No," he said quietly. "We did it." And as the human fleet stood battered but alive, Ethan knew. Humanity had just shown the galaxy why they were not to be underestimated.